Hey guys, tonight, we're slipping into the silk-draped bedchambers of medieval nobles, where the candlelight flickers, the chamber pots are close at hand, and someone is very dramatically moaning under the covers. But don't worry, they're not dying. They're just bored. In fact, tonight's story is about nobles in the Middle Ages who faked illnesses not to escape their duties, but to entertain themselves and confuse everyone around them. Yep, when you're wealthy, cloistered, and have nothing better to do, pretending to have gout or demonic possession becomes a perfectly valid pastime. You probably won't survive this level of nonsense without wincing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing those pop up from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins in a stone manor somewhere in 13th century Aquitaine. Outside, rain lashes against the lead glass windows. Inside, Lord Renaud lies sprawled across his velvet-lined bed, clutching his chest with one hand and ringing a tiny bell with the other. His servant Gervais trudges in with a sigh, already suspecting what's coming. Renaud has declared he's dying from a rare condition that he just learned about from a traveling apothecary, something to do with excess black bile and the wrong kind of wind. Gervais is not convinced. He's seen this before. Last week it was St. Anthony's fire. The week before it was a fainting spell induced by spiritual overload. Each time it results in a dramatic flailing of arms, weepy farewells, and a request for someone to fetch a priest, an astrologer, and some honey-drenched figs. But here's the thing, Reynolds not mad. He's just playing a very elaborate game. You see, nobles in medieval courts were often trapped by their own privilege, with lands to manage but stewards to do it for them, with hunts to attend. But no real danger with tournaments that had grown increasingly ritualized. Life could get monotonous. For some, staging elaborate fake illnesses was a way to spice up the day. It offered attention, sympathy, indulgences from confession, and sometimes even political advantages. You couldn't attend court because you were dying of the vapors. How tragic. Here have a tax extension. Renaud, like many of his kind, had grown quite talented at the art. He'd memorized the symptoms of all the known maladies in his herbals down to the color of his urine and the supposed pulses of his liver. Sometimes he'd even arrange for a local wise woman to confirm the diagnosis. She'd peer at his tongue, nod sagely, and whisper that the moon's alignment meant he must stay in bed for 3 more days. During this time, he'd host a captive audience, friends, rivals, suitors who came to pay their respects, gossip, and marvel at how bravely he bore his imaginary suffering. Of course, Renaud wasn't alone in this. The Countess of Béziers had once locked herself in her tower for a full week, claiming soul fever, a non-existent spiritual illness, supposedly caused by reading too much scripture. When questioned, she replied that the words of St. Augustine had made her heart beat too hard for earthly light to bear. Even the royal courts were not immune. There are records, half satirical, half concerned, of entire court calendars being disrupted because the Queen's cousin had taken to bed with a case of inverted humors, which required the palace's best musicians to play non-stop lute music to soothe her. Why did they do it? Sometimes for sympathy, sometimes for power, and sometimes, more often than you'd think, just for sport. The line between theater and reality was very thin in medieval noble life. And illness, it was the perfect stage. Back in Renaud's room, he now requests the windows be opened. "I need the chill to remind me I'm alive," he whispers. Gervais obliges, though he knows it's just part of today's act. Soon enough, there will be a request for mulled wine followed by a moaned confession that he might be dying of a broken heart. What caused it? No one knows. Probably the maid who refused to embroider his name into her apron. And as Gervais fetches the wine, he passes the steward in the hall. "What's it today?" the steward asks. Some kind of internal imbalance, Gervais shrugs. The steward nods. "Tuesday, then. Because that's how it worked. A different drama every few days, and each one more absurd than the last. Renaud will rise tomorrow with miraculous vigor, declaring that a vision cured him. Then he'll host a feast in celebration. Pheasants, honeyed nuts, and a reenactment of his own death scene complete with props. Welcome to the world of medieval medical cosplay. And we've only just begun. The feast begins, as always, with exaggerated solemnity. Renaud arrives at his own recovery banquet in a robe too long for him, walking slowly with a polished cane he doesn't need. His cheeks are dusted with just enough ash to suggest he's been kissed by mortality. The guests bow low, play along, and murmur how close they were to losing him. A local friar offers a brief prayer for his continued survival, though he's caught smirking when he thinks no one's looking. You sit across from Renaud, chewing on a piece of boar that's been roasted and soaked in vinegar. It tastes like smoke and sour cherries. A musician is plucking away at a harp in the corner. Above you, the banners ripple in the drafty hall. The entire event is half wake, half comedy. But the most curious thing is how serious everyone pretends to be. This isn't mockery, it's tradition. These nobles have made a culture out of playing sick. Illness is a social event, and your status depends not just on your birth, but on how creatively you can suffer. That's why the Count of Luneville once held an entire poetry competition in his chambers, while lying in bed with a damp cloth on his head, pretending he was dying of melancholic dismay. Contestants were asked to write verses about how terribly they would miss him. The winner was allowed to borrow his hawk for a weekend. The loser had to recite his losing poem at the castle's latrine. In fact, faking illness had become a kind of performance art among the upper class. The more refined your fake affliction, the more respected your intellect. Anyone could pretend to have a fever. But only someone with taste would invent an illness caused by looking too long at stained glass, or a dream so beautiful the soul refuses to wake. These were seen as the signature maladies of the cultured elite. Sometimes these invented illnesses were used as social tools. Lady Arabelle of Rouen famously feigned sudden blindness when her least favorite cousin arrived uninvited. For 3 days, she claimed she could only see the outline of those who mattered. Her cousin left in a huff, and miraculously her vision returned the next morning. Or take the young nobleman Etienne, who fell in love with a visiting baroness. Too shy to speak to her directly, he declared himself overtaken by a mysterious swoon every time she entered the room. His physicians were summoned, of course. They found nothing wrong, but Etienne insisted he could not feel his legs in her presence. When she finally took his hand, his sensation returned. They were married 3 months later. These games were more than whimsy, they were strategy. Nobles lived in a tightly wound web of appearances, obligations, alliances, and etiquette. Being unwell was a polite way to bow out of a duel delay, a marriage, or avoid an unwelcome visit from the tax collector. If you could pretend just convincingly enough, you bought yourself time and possibly sympathy. No one dared call you a liar. That would be a breach of honor. Even the church played along. Priests and monks were sometimes called in to diagnose these fanciful conditions, and many obliged. After all, a noble family was a generous patron, and a well-placed confirmation of spiritual imbalance could lead to generous alms for the monastery. One abbey claimed they had cured a knight's son of a haunting cough of regret by burying a silver coin under his pillow and praying through the night. The boy was fine the next day, Coincidentally, so was the Abbey's roof fund. But it wasn't always harmless. Sometimes these performances took on a darker tone. In the castle of Duke Henri the Mad, a man who may or may not have truly lost his wits, illness faking, turned into something more sinister. Henri believed that spirits lived in his bloodstream. He would host dinners in silence only to erupt in a rage midway through and accuse his courtiers of poisoning his spleen with their jealousy. Servants who laughed were dismissed. Those who cried were promoted. And then there were the copycats. Once nobles started using illness as entertainment, the lesser aristocrats followed suit. Soon, entire households were consumed by staged infirmities. A steward might claim his knees ached only when faced with financial records. A tutor might develop a limp to avoid walking across cold stone floors in the morning. One chambermaid feigned laryngitis so she wouldn't have to gossip, only to recover suspiciously fast whenever scandal broke out. It became hard to tell who was really ill and who was just putting on a good show. And that perhaps is what kept the charade going. You look around Reynolds' feast. A few guests dab their eyes some raised goblets, and a couple snicker behind their napkins. They all know the game. They've all played it. And if you listen closely, you can already hear whispers about who might fall ill next. Word is the Viscountess of Elna has grown faint with ennui, which in noble speak means she's about to host a 10-course dinner in bed while claiming she can only digest food if it's served on silver warmed by the breath of virgins. It's going to be a long season, and the competition is only getting stranger. You leave the feast sometime after midnight, belly full of honeyed pears and venison ears still ringing with laughter and lute music. Behind you, Renaud lies sprawled across a couch in the solar, pretending to be weak from so much merriment. Recovering, he calls it, though he's nursing his third goblet of wine and already planning next week's affliction. Word is he's leaning toward something exotic, maybe a Persian wind fever, or a condition caused by sleeping too close to moonlight. But as the servants clear the dishes and extinguish the torches, one by one, something deeper lingers in the air. You start to realize this isn't just about games and privilege. Faking illness had become a way for medieval nobles to express feelings they weren't allowed to show otherwise. Grief, fear, shame, these weren't things you said out loud in a hall full of armor and pride. But under the veil of illness, now that was safe. By the next morning, you're riding to another estate. The road is muddy and the mist clings low. You arrive at the home of Lady Sansia, a baroness renowned for her delicate constitution and her even more delicate sense of timing. Sansia had once famously taken to bed for 3 days because someone wore the wrong shade of green to her banquet. It upset my gallbladder, she claimed. Now she's faking something new, invisible fever, a condition that cannot be measured by touch, only described in poetry. Her maid, a woman with a face like a lemon rind, ushers you in with a warning. She's very weak, but still accepting compliments. You step into her chamber. There she lies, propped up by 6 pillows, cheeks, carefully flushed with beetroot stain, wearing a loose linen gown, embroidered with birds mid-swoon. A thin veil covers her face, not for modesty, she says, but to filter the air of envy and impoliteness. She barely speaks, only sighs. You sit beside her, and she reaches out to press your hand fingers like ice. My dreams, she whispers, have been too beautiful. I fear they are stealing the color from my waking life. A notary stands silently in the corner, ready to record her final words should today be the day. But it won't be. It never is. By afternoon, she's directing the housekeeper to rearrange the floral arrangements. The tulips are too close to the lavender, and the scent is shifting her balance of humors. The notary, knowing the game, quietly scribbles a line about ephemeral violet exhaustion and excuses himself to update her official health report. Here, illness is status. To be sick is to be fascinating. To suffer dramatically is to earn reverence and freedom in a world that stifles even the mildly unconventional. Lady Sancia is just one of many noble women who have found liberation through symptoms. In a society where most of her choices were dictated by birth etiquette or marital alliance, her invented illness gives her power over guests, over suitors, over servants. She decides when she's well enough to attend church, or to be courted, or to negotiate a land transfer. And all the while she is adored. You hear of others too. The Duke of Tours, who faked deafness for half a year just to avoid having to hear his sister-in-law's political ramblings. He kept it up through entire meals, even hired a servant to loudly interpret conversations in gestures. When he finally announced that his hearing had miraculously returned after a peasant touched his cloak, he held a festival and declared it a holy event. The church didn't challenge it. No one wanted to upset a donor who might suddenly go blind next. And then there's the curious case of Brother Jean-Claude, a monk who began exhibiting signs of saintly trance, complete with sudden collapses, whispered prophecy, and strange movements of the hands during Mass. Pilgrims came from villages away to witness him. He was never officially diagnosed, because frankly, no one wanted to be the one to break the spell. The abbey began selling healing water from the fountain he once fainted beside. Donations tripled. It was later discovered that Jean-Claude's trances occurred only after particularly bad choir practices, but by then it didn't matter. The myth had taken root. The medieval world was one where mystery ruled daily life, where science, medicine, magic, and belief were tangled together like ivy on stone. To fake illness in that world wasn't to lie necessarily. It was to participate in a performance everyone secretly agreed to respect. The body became the stage, the symptoms, the script, and the audience, always willing to play along as long as they were invited to whisper and wonder. As the afternoon sun sets behind Lady Sancia's garden, you watch as a young scribe delivers her new cure in the form of a poem tied with silk. It's about Swallow's grief and a misplaced shoe. She sighs, eyes closed. Yes, she murmurs, I feel my soul returning. Slowly. She'll be hosting a masked ball by the end of the week. But for now, she is fragile, mysterious, worshipped, and thoroughly in control. The masked ball arrives sooner than expected. Invitations are sent by falcon, wax-sealed and perfumed, each scroll declaring that the Lady Sancia, through divine providence and the bitter medicine of longing, has been restored to partial strength. Not full, of course. Just enough to stand for a moment, then recline dramatically beneath silk canopies while others dance in her honor. You attend naturally. Everyone does. And the theme, illness and rapture. Guests are encouraged to dress as their favorite afflictions, metaphorical or otherwise. One man comes cloaked in ash and roses, claiming to be the embodiment of emotional vertigo. A woman wears a headdress shaped like lungs and coughs poetically every few minutes. Someone else wraps themselves in blue tulle and calls it the fever of dreams denied. Lady Sancia appears last, carried in on a chaise of carved oak by 4 footmen in black. Her gown is layered in mourning white, her lips pale, her eyes lined with kohl to suggest she's still recovering from visions. She doesn't speak. Only nods regally slowly, as though the air were too heavy for words. When a guest kneels before her and whispers that she's never looked so luminous, she raises a gloved hand to her chest and utters, "That is the danger of being close to the void." The entire crowd swoons, figuratively of course. These events, as strange as they seem, are more than theater. They're cultural rituals that allow nobles to navigate their tightly constrained world. Here, within the rules of elaborate fantasy, they can express fear of mortality, fear of aging, fear of becoming irrelevant. They can mourn without reason, grieve without loss, seek sympathy without shame. You begin to see the deeper pattern. Illness is an alibi, an escape route from obligations and scrutiny. To be unwell means you can decline marriage proposals without insulting the suitor. You can retreat from politics without appearing weak. You can disappear for days, even weeks, into candlelit rooms and emerge whenever you choose, restored, mysterious, and more interesting than ever. And yet there are rules to the game. You learn that not all ailments are equally fashionable. Real illness is too messy, too unpredictable. Nobles who actually fall ill, who vomit, who bleed, who lose control of their bodies, are quietly hidden away. Their conditions are whispered about, their names faded from court gossip. To fake illness is art. To be truly sick is tragedy, and the medieval elite prefer their tragedies fictional. That's why Lord Bartram's case caused such a stir. A proud courtier known for his dramatic performances, he once claimed to be struck mute for a week by a bad flute solo. Bartram vanished one winter and returned in spring visibly thinner, pale, and quiet. Rumors said he'd caught the sweating sickness in the lowlands. When he returned, he insisted he'd been away seeking divine wisdom. No one believed it, but no one asked. He no longer faked anything after that. His performances stopped. His laughter dimmed. Something about the real thing had drained the pleasure out of it all. You saw him at a banquet once, sitting in the corner watching as another young lord mimicked hiccups caused by a romantic imbalance. Bartram didn't even smile. Maybe that's why these nobles pretend. Not because they don't fear illness, but because they fear it so much that they have to mock it. Dress it up in silks and riddles, make it manageable, turn it into a pet, give it funny names. If you can laugh at it, maybe it won't find you. That same night, you hear a whisper of something even stranger. In the northern courts of Burgundy, there's a trend sweeping among the younger nobles, fake group illnesses. Whole households are claiming synchronized symptoms, seasonal melancholy, collective nervous palpitations, or spontaneous group forgetfulness. It's the newest fashion, apparently. The more people who pretend to catch the same invisible disease, the more intriguing the house becomes. A diplomat from Flanders tells you he attended a banquet where no one spoke aloud because they all had phantom throat frost. Instead, they passed parchment back and forth with hand-scrawled compliments. One lady fainted from the effort of writing too fast. Applause was silent but enthusiastic. You returned to your chambers that night, brain spinning with absurdity but heart strangely full. Because under all the bizarre behavior, you realize something oddly tender is unfolding. These people, silly, spoiled, ridiculous, are also human. They're finding a way to express emotions their society won't let them speak of directly. Fear becomes a symptom. Longing becomes a faint. Heartbreak becomes a cough. And the rest of the world, knowingly or not, plays along. Outside the castle quiets. The torches are dimmed. In some corner tower, a noble lies still under feathered quilts, composing a dramatic letter to a lover who never replied. He'll claim the silence has caused a curvature of his spirit. He'll ask for sympathy. And if he's clever, he'll receive it. Morning creeps in on slippered feet. Light filters through stained glass windows, painting the stone floors with fragments of saints and angels. Somewhere down the corridor, a lute plays softly, and two kitchen servants argue about whether noble blood can truly turn sour in the spring. You step into the great hall, where a new rumor already floats like incense Count Odon has taken to his bed, with a mysterious affliction, lethargia amorosa, or the love-induced slow death. He claims his heart slows when he thinks of Lady Iseldra, and all clocks in his manor have been stopped to match his pulse. You barely react. At this point, it would be stranger not to hear something like that. You travel again, this time to the eastern edge of a duchy, where the trees grow tall and the nobles taller still in their tales. The castle here is narrow, ivy-wrapped, and shrouded in permanent fog. Lord Thibault rules the estate, or rather, he languishes within it. He's known throughout the region not for his politics or swordplay, but for the astounding length of his permanent convalescence. He has not risen from bed in 6 years. Each season brings a new diagnosis, often proclaimed from his canopied chamber by his personal alchemist. Too much sunlight in the marrow. A surplus of lunar exposure. Nostalgic bone drift. These are not jokes. These are documents stamped and sealed. And Thibault, he thrives in it. His chamber is his court. Couriers arrive daily bringing letters, visitors, and reports from lands he pretends not to govern. He receives them all while lying sideways in a silk robe, a fox fur draped across his shoulders, eyes half-lidded like a Byzantine martyr. Sometimes he delivers decrees in verse. Sometimes he weeps during conversations and attributes it to emotional salt leaching from the lungs. But here's the twist, he's sharper than most dukes. He has memorized property maps, harvest cycles, genealogies, and rival house secrets. He corresponds with bishops, merchants, poets. He never leaves the bed, but somehow his reach is everywhere. His illness is real only in appearance. In reality, it's his throne. An illness that commands obedience is safer than an open display of power. People fear a strong noble, but they adore a tragic one. You spend a week under Thibault's roof and begin to understand the architecture of the game. Faking illness isn't about deception, it's about creating a theater where emotion becomes influence. In a world bound by rigid expectations, especially for nobles, expressing pain is one of the only forms of freedom. And if that pain is dramatic, poetic, and cloaked in perfumed linens, even better. One evening during supper in the chamber, because of course he dines from bed, Thibault shares something rare honesty. He turns to you and says softly, "You know I'm not weak. I just learned it's easier to be loved when you are." Then after a pause, if I stood up, they'd expect too much. He raises his goblet with a faint smile. To manageable suffering. Later alone in the guest quarters, you reflect on how much of this medieval world is driven by pageantry. Nobles pretend to be knights, lovers pretend to pine, and everyone pretends to understand Latin. Why wouldn't illness join the charade? It's safer than war, quieter than rebellion, and if played well, twice as effective. But there's always a line. At dinner the next day, you hear about the tragic case of Lady Alex. She was clever, too clever. She faked a nervous condition that made her speak in riddles and reverse logic. For a while it made her popular, entertaining, mysterious, but she didn't know when to stop. Eventually, even when she wanted to return to normal speech, her court didn't believe her. They thought it was just another level of the act. She became trapped in her own performance, speaking in spirals until her words meant nothing. One by one, visitors stopped coming. She faded into the background of her own legend. That's the risk. When you make your sickness, your identity, recovery becomes a threat. The moment you're well again, the spotlight dims. The world returns to its ordinary grind, and maybe, just maybe, you no longer know how to walk in it. You sleep uneasily that night. Not because of the cold stones or the howling wind, but because you begin to ask a dangerous question. What if the fakers aren't pretending anymore? What if after years of staging symptoms, they believe in them? Tybalt dreams of ghosts who enter through the fireplace. He calls it chimney madness. His steward records the symptoms diligently, already planning the next week's excuse for missing a diplomatic visit. And outside in the garden, a group of noble children run in circles, giggling, shouting that they've caught spring fever, a term that started as a jest, but might just become their truth if they repeat it enough. Pretend long enough, and the mask clings to your face. You leave Tybalt's ivy-choked castle with more questions than answers, your head full of powdered linens, sighing nobles, and words like chimney madness, echoing with unnerving weight. The road back toward the southern duchies is thick with slush, and the passing peasants don't bother with stories. They're too busy hauling firewood, tending oxen, and surviving real fevers no one writes poems about. There's no room for delicate maladies when your roof leaks, and your bread is made from bark and oats. That's part of what strikes you hardest now, this bizarre divide between theatrical illness and brutal reality. In the villages, sickness means empty cradles and shallow graves. But in the manor houses, it's a game of veil, a whispered tool of manipulation and longing. By the time you arrive at the estate of Lord Amori, the snow is melting, and the air smells of wet hay and damp stone. Amori is known across the countryside for hosting recovery salons gatherings, where nobles come not to heal, but to look like they are healing. His estate boasts sun-warmed terraces, imported fruit juices, Turkish blankets, and a menu of gentle afflictions, spiritual fatigue, gooseflesh, melancholy, and the famously vague but endlessly fashionable sensibilities generales. You walk into the garden courtyard and see them all there, draped on benches like drying laundry, their pale wrists extended toward the sun, eyes closed just enough to suggest existential agony. One man is dictating a letter from beneath a lace parasol, claiming he cannot hold a quill due to wrist nostalgia. A lady in yellow fans herself every time a dog barks nearby, saying loud noises rattle her ribcage memories. It would be absurd if it weren't also beautiful in a strange way. There's a poetry to it all, a pageantry that makes you understand how intoxicating it must be to exist entirely within metaphor. In a world of wars, plagues, and strict social codes, this gentle play-acting is a rebellion wrapped in silk. Amori himself greets you from a velvet chaise beneath an orange tree. His eyes are hollowed perfectly, whether from candlelight or coal you cannot say. He clasps your hand weakly by design and smiles. I've recently discovered a condition called cloud ache, he says, voice as soft as cake flour. It happens when the sky is overcast and the heart absorbs too much gray. I've written sonnets about it. You nod. Of course he has. These salons are more than gossip circles. They're performance theaters, therapeutic retreats, and social arenas all rolled into one. Nobles come here to curate their afflictions, the way others might curate a library or a wine cellar. Everyone is searching for the perfect malady, something obscure enough to sound unique, dramatic enough to earn admiration, and vague enough to never require proof. Amori, as it turns out, is the curator of them all. He keeps a handwritten catalog titled The Illnesses of the Sensitive Mind, bound in red leather and updated weekly. Inside are pages of invented ailments with elegant descriptions and recommended gestures. The sighing spleen, chrono-echo, invisible bruising of the ego. He lends it to guests who need inspiration. It's rumored that one duchess from Lyon found her husband by feigning fragile moon pressure at a reading and fainting directly into the arms of a nearby baron. But not everyone approves of this game. You're warned not to speak of these practices to visiting clergy. The church, after all, keeps a wary eye on noble eccentricities. They tolerate pious suffering illnesses that point toward divine tests, spiritual discipline, or martyrdom. But this flippant romanticization of pain, this theater of the body, it verges on blasphemy. To pretend sickness for amusement is to mock real affliction, and to place suffering on display, gilded and glorified risks, calling the wrath of heaven. Some confessors have even begun issuing penance to those suspected of faking. One priest reportedly made a noblewoman walk barefoot for a mile because she claimed she had weeping ankles from too many compliments. Another demanded a noble recite the Book of Job aloud each morning until his melancholic bones stopped acting up. Still, the practice continues. Even as Amori's guests sip herbal broths and whisper about their next made-up malaise, others are adapting the tradition to the political stage. A marquis seeking to avoid court trial recently claimed he'd been struck with legal vertigo, an illness that caused nausea at the sight of documents. Another noblewoman delayed signing a treaty by saying she suffered from ink allergy, which caused her hands to cramp in the presence of quills. These people have turned faking illness into a high art, a power move, a social strategy, a personal escape. And you begin to wonder, is it all just silliness or is there a kind of genius to it? Amori seems to think so. That evening, after the last toast of plum cordial and the garden lanterns are lit, he leans in and says, "If kings can rule through bloodlines and coin, why shouldn't I rule through mood?" It's hard to argue with him, because in this world of aching spleens, mood swings become revolutions, emotions become armor, and a single cough, well-timed, well-framed, might change the course of an alliance or delay a war or win a heart. You sleep that night in a chamber that smells faintly of lavender and paper. Outside your window, someone is sighing rhythmically in the courtyard. Practicing, perhaps. Or maybe just hoping someone is listening. The next morning, a hush spreads through Amori's estate like perfume on velvet. Something has happened. You're sipping warm wine on the terrace when a page boy rushes past, too excited to keep it in. The Countess fainted during breakfast, he blurts, right into a bowl of stewed apricots. Everyone says it was divine. Naturally, you follow the whispers. Inside the central parlor, a crowd has gathered. Some lean forward in fascination, others dab at their eyes as if witnessing a miracle. And there she is, Countess Isabeau of Montclair, reclining on a velvet settee, her wrists limp over the edge, a damp cloth on her brow, and a trail of fruit syrup still visible on her bodice. A troubadour is already composing a ballad about it, the apricot collapse of Isabeau. She doesn't speak, not directly. Instead, she lifts her fingers like wilted petals and gestures toward a steward who dutifully announces her new diagnosis. Frisson of the soul. Amori, standing nearby with the look of a delighted patron, declares it the most authentic performance of the season. But others aren't so sure. A gray-haired baroness in the back murmurs that Isabeau has done this before. A younger noble scoffs and claims he saw her eyes open during the faint. There's a growing tension in the room, a quiet reckoning. The same game that once charmed is now under scrutiny. Fainting into fruit may be poetic, yes, but do it too often and it begins to look calculated. You realize something else too, the nobles are growing more competitive. With each season, the illnesses become stranger, the performances grander. Last month, someone claimed to suffer from echo syndrome, where every word must be whispered twice to properly exit the lungs. Another lord has started communicating solely in sighs, explaining that speech weighs too heavily on his ribs. The game has escalated beyond mere evasion or boredom. Now it's about outdoing one another. Suffering, real or fake, has become a form of prestige. The more elaborate your condition, the more attention you receive. The more attention you receive, the more influence you hold. And in a courtly world, where survival often depends on who notices you faking illness, might just be safer than brandishing a sword. And yet the danger is mounting. You hear talk of one noble Sir Guillard who recently died. No one is sure whether it was poison pneumonia or just an unfortunate moment of commitment. He'd been performing silent suffocation for 3 weeks, insisting he could not speak above a breath. Some say he choked on a grape. Others say he forgot to breathe entirely too deep into character. Whatever the truth, his death has cast a long shadow. For the first time, you see nervous glances pass between the guests. The performances continue, but with more caution. Isabeau is helped up from the couch, and a physician is summoned, just in case. He pronounces her delicately distressed and prescribes poetry and a temporary fast from compliments. You return to your room and sit by the window watching the sky shift to gray. The clouds hang low, and for a moment you understand why Amaury invented cloud ache. There's something oppressive about the air today, something you can't quite name. Maybe you're tired of pretending too. That night a storm rolls in. Thunder shudders through the hallways, and someone screams an actual unplanned shriek. It turns out a tapestry fell off the wall, startling a lady mid-dream. But the scream spreads panic. Guests bolt from their chambers, some weeping, others shivering dramatically, as if seized by prophetic tremors. You stand back and watch it unfold. A handful of nobles clearly relish the chaos, another excuse for a faint, a swoon, a new invented tremor. But a few look genuinely scared. It's hard to tell now where performance ends and reality begins. Are they trembling for effect? Or because they've finally convinced themselves the night carries omens? One man collapses in the corridor, muttering about blood in the sky. A chambermaid claims to feel shadows in her stomach. Amaury himself announces he is struck with ancestral dread and locks himself in the library with 3 oranges and a book of curses. You retreat to your room, bolt the door, and sit in the candlelight, listening to the wind. The games, the maladies, the courtly pantomime, it's all spiraling. What began as gentle rebellion, as elegant escapism, now skirts something darker. Some of them you think have gotten lost inside their own inventions. And what happens to a noble who forgets how to be well? What happens when the illness outlives its usefulness? Outside, the storm rages on. Inside, the castle simmers in a quiet kind of madness. And morning still feels a long, long way off. The storm passes, but the aftershocks ripple for days. When the sun finally returns, it does so shyly, filtered through mist and chilled air, as if the sky itself were recovering from a fit. The courtiers, too, emerge cautiously, blinking in the light, like night creatures unsure how to behave in day. They shuffle through the halls in slippers, muttering about dreams that felt too real to be fictional. One young noble insists the storm triggered a sleeping illness in him. He has refused to wake fully now, communicating solely in yawns and soft humming. Amaury remains in the library for another 2 days. When he finally returns, his eyes are rimmed in darkness, his fingers ink-stained, and he announces with great gravity that he has discovered a new affliction, bibliopathic melancholia, an ache of the soul caused by reading too much truth in too short a time. No one questions it. They applaud. But the storm seems to have changed something. There's a tension in the air now, a heaviness beneath the usual silken poses. You hear more coughing than usual, less theatrical sighing. There are murmurs that someone, the Viscount of Perot, has actually taken ill. Not courtly ill, but truly bodily ill, fevered, raving, and it's thrown everyone off, because no one knows what to do when real illness enters the theater. You see it in their faces. Behind the fans and veils, the nobles are frightened. Their pantomimes offered control, safe performances in a world where the real thing was terrifying. But now the line is blurring, and no one is sure if they're still pretending or if they've finally danced too close to the fire. One evening you find yourself beside Amaury in the orangery, watching sunlight turn the citrus trees gold. He speaks without preamble. "We used to do this for fun," he says, voice barely more than a breeze. A little drama, a little sigh. "But now, I think they need it. It's not a choice anymore. It's habit. It's survival." He looks older somehow. Not physically, but in the way his smile fades too fast. You ask him what he means. He picks at the peel of a fruit slowly, methodically. "Everyone here is afraid," he says, "of time, of silence, of being ordinary. Illness gives them a shape to disappear into, something romantic, something sacred. It makes the nothingness seem meaningful." And you realize he's right. The performances have grown more intense, more desperate. You hear of nobles sleeping in coffins to better understand the tragedy of breath. One lady insists she's allergic to Mondays and won't speak until Tuesday noon. A young knight feigns dizziness every time he hears his own name, claiming it echoes with ancestral pressure. You begin to notice something disturbing. The performances don't end. Once they were weekend affairs, occasional retreats from duty. Now they stretch for weeks, then months. You meet a countess who hasn't spoken aloud in over a year, only scribbles cryptic notes on lace handkerchiefs. Her household claims she's locked in a poetic fever, but her eyes tell you she doesn't remember how to stop. Another noble insists he's slowly turning to glass. He wears gloves, moves gently, never lets anyone touch him. It began as an elegant metaphor, but now he flinches from doorways, from furniture, from people. You reach for his shoulder once in comfort, and he recoils as if your fingers might shatter him. This is no longer pretense. It's a kind of court-wide psychosis, an epidemic of invented fragility that has paradoxically become very real. The court physicians are baffled. Their leech jars remain untouched. No one wants real medicine. And the church has grown increasingly stern. A letter arrives from a bishop warning that false suffering invites true judgment. It's read aloud during a banquet, but no one listens. The host claims he's developed selective hearing that blocks sermons. And yet you see more and more nobles secretly consulting herbalists and mystics. Quietly, shamefully, as if their bodies are failing them in a way that can't be controlled with poetry or performance anymore. The metaphors are cracking. The illnesses are taking root. Even Amaury begins to fade. His eyes, once bright with clever deceit, grow dull. He forgets names, forgets that he's supposed to be pretending. One morning he looks at you blankly and asks, "Do you know what I'm sick with today? You don't know whether to laugh or cry. It's spreading like mold through the silks." The castle, once buzzing with coy fainting and playful melancholy, now echoes with silence and unspoken dread. What began as rebellion has become imprisonment. What started as play has become pathology. And no one, not even the most seasoned performers, seems able to find the exit. You lie awake that night and wonder if the illness was ever fake at all. Or if perhaps it was always something deeper waiting beneath the surface, disguised as a game until it no longer needed the costume. The court no longer hosts feasts, not proper ones anyway. There are gatherings, quiet, strained affairs, where nobles sit at long tables draped in black cloth, sipping broth, or nibbling on herbs, said to soothe inner trembling. Laughter is rare now, and when it does come, it startles the room like a dropped goblet. Someone always coughs after. You begin to feel it yourself, not an illness exactly, but a disquiet, a kind of shared fatigue that clings to your boots and your breath. You're not faking anything, but you're also no longer sure anyone is. It's as if all those years of pretending have hollowed something out in these people, and now the echo is louder than the original voice ever was. One evening, a new guest arrives. He's different. Upright, bright-eyed, unfashionably alert. A physician from the Low Countries invited by a desperate cousin of Amori's. He wears no jewels, speaks directly, observes sharply. His name is Master Alderic, and he does not believe in cloud ache or inverted humors or glass body syndrome. He's seen plague war wounds, starvation. This place, he declares, is not sick. It is infected with fiction. Naturally, everyone hates him. But he insists on seeing Amori, who by now has retreated to his chamber and only speaks in second-hand phrases borrowed from poetry. The once grand performer now lies beneath a canopy of dull silk eyes, half-lidded, barely moving. He whispers phrases like, "Time is a bruise, and I feel thin in the soul." Alderic examines him in silence. When he emerges, he does not announce a diagnosis. Instead, he asks a question no one has dared voice aloud in months. "Why are you all doing this to yourselves?" The nobles don't answer. Some leave the room. Others pretend not to hear. A few reach for their notebooks, ready to jot down his words as possible symptoms. Alderic doesn't give up. Over the next few days, he moves through the estate like a cold wind, opening windows, discarding incense, forcing fresh bread into long, untouched kitchens. He demands people walk outside. He organizes dances. One morning, he forces 3 guests to climb a hill and return with something they've never noticed before. It goes poorly. Lady Sancia returns in tears, saying the hill reminded her of unspoken topographies of grief. Another guest claims his ankle developed existential swelling. A third just sits in the fountain, staring into the water, as if waiting for his reflection to apologize. You try to speak to Alderic, ask what he thinks will come of this. He's blunt. They don't want to be well, he says. They've made a home inside their sickness, not because they enjoy it, but because it's the only part of their world they control. You walk with him that afternoon, along the outer walls of the estate. He tells you stories of real pain, mothers who sold their shoes for medicine soldiers with rot in their bones, children who died before they learned to speak. They don't have the luxury of invented fragility, he says. They don't compose sonnets about coughs. They just suffer. And still, you find yourself defending these nobles. Yes, they're absurd. Yes, they've lost the thread. But wasn't this always their only way to feel, to break free of expectation and etiquette and obligation? Didn't their melodrama shield them, if only briefly, from the crushing weight of history and duty and war? Alderic nods slowly, perhaps seeing your point. Maybe he says, but they mistook performance for healing. They wrote scripts instead of facing silence. And now they've forgotten who they were before the act. You return to the manor that night to find Amori sitting up for the first time in days. He isn't speaking yet, but he's awake, eyes tracking the firelight. You sit beside him and he doesn't flinch. For the first time in a long while, he isn't adorned or powdered or pretending. He's just there, alive, exhausted, real. In the hallway, a group of younger nobles rehearse a new ailment, something involving lingering nostalgia of the fingertips. But their voices are quieter now, less certain, as if Alderic's arrival cracked the mirror, and no one's sure whether to look directly at it. You lie in bed that night listening to wind rattle the shutters. You wonder if this whole castle will one day be remembered not for its tapestries or triumphs, but for this peculiar era when the nobility fell into a fever dream of their own making. When illness became art and art became asylum, and you wonder what happens next. When the fiction stops working. Morning returns without ceremony, gray, still, and a little colder than before. The castle seems to exhale as though it's been holding its breath through the storm of its own delusions. The peacocks in the garden call out once, then fall quiet. The air feels less perfumed today, and the courtiers rise a little slower, as if unsure whether to resume their usual roles or simply stop. Word spreads that Amori walked 6 steps today. Not dramatically, not as part of a performance, just 6 small, unannounced steps across his chamber floor. A servant saw it. No attendants were summoned. No declarations were made. He just walked, and then sat down. The ripple effect is subtle but unmistakable. At breakfast, no one speaks in riddles. The table is quieter. No new ailments are announced. Lady Isabeau stirs her porridge with unsteady hands, her eyes distant as though searching for symptoms she can no longer summon. Someone near her mutters, "I don't think I'm tired anymore," like a confession. Alderic has shifted the balance of the place, but he hasn't conquered it. That afternoon, he tries to organize a gathering on the lawn. No veils, no sighing, just chairs, sun, and conversation. Some nobles come out of curiosity or defiance, but others remain inside curtains drawn wrapped in their invented symptoms, like favorite cloaks. The old world isn't ready to die just yet. You sit beside Alderic, watching those who do attend. A young lord attempts to speak, plainly fails, then returns to metaphor. "The air is too sharp," he says. "It's cutting the dreams out of me." But he laughs after. A real embarrassed laugh. That alone feels like progress. Still, you know this won't be a quick transformation. The sickness here is layered. It's not just about pretending to cough or collapse. It's about the emotional scaffolding built around those acts. The safety, the identity, the structure it gave to lives other was hollowed out by duty and surveillance. To abandon their illnesses would be to step out into a space where there are no scripts, no sympathies, no rituals, just silence, just themselves. Later, you visit the old chapel at the edge of the estate. It smells of candle wax and time. Inside, you find journals decades worth, bound in faded leather, written in the careful hands of generations of nobles. Pages upon pages describing ailments that never existed, the hollow lung, the ache of seasonal absence, memory fever. Each entry is part prayer, part diary, part desperate art. Some are heartbreaking in their honesty. One reads, "I said I had fever because I missed her. It was easier than saying I cried." They brought soup. That helped too. You run your fingers along the spines of these volumes. The illusion was never simply deception. It was expression, translation. A language these nobles were allowed to speak when every other kind of honesty was forbidden. You close the chapel door gently when you leave. There's a strange reverence in that space. Back in the manor, Amori asks to see you. He's sitting by the window now, hands clasped a shawl across his knees, more for habit than need. He's quiet for a long time, then finally speaks, I think. I forgot who I was in the middle of all that. You nod. He looks out over the orchard. I still want to pretend. Sometimes. Just to feel special again. He pauses. But maybe it's time to let that be enough. The wanting, not the performance. It's the most honest thing he's ever said to you. You leave him to his thoughts and step out into the evening. The sky is pale and clear. You see two courtiers playing chess on the terrace, not as a metaphor, just as a game. Another noble is writing something without sighing, between every word. The change is slow, uneven. Some will cling to their imaginary ailments until the end. But others, they might just walk away. And you too feel something loosening in your chest. A breath you didn't know you were holding. A weight you thought belonged only to others. Maybe this isn't about illness at all. Maybe it's about learning how to exist without adornment. Just bare and alive. You awaken the next day to a strange sound silence. Not the usual orchestrated hush of noble melancholy, but true unplanned quiet. No coughing echoes through the halls. No dramatic sighs spill from bedchambers. No pages announcing the latest fashionable affliction. It's unsettling at first, like a theater with no curtain call, but as you pull back your heavy quilt and step onto the cool stone floor, it feels clean, still, real. Word has spread that Lady Iseldra burned her entire collection of lace masks, dozens of them each used to represent a different delicate condition in public. I don't even remember what my real face looks like, she'd whispered before lighting the fire. Maybe now I'll find out. The nobles watch her bonfire from the upper balconies, unsure whether to cheer or cry. In the grand salon, Lord Beltran has begun speaking without his usual translator. For years, he pretended to have a condition that rendered his speech too sacred for common ears. A steward would recite his thoughts in flowery, elevated prose. Today, Beltran speaks for himself. His voice is lower than you imagined, halting, but honest. And in the garden, two young women walk side by side, arms linked, reciting not symptoms, but dreams, real ones. One wants to ride to the coast. The other wants to learn how to write in Greek. Neither mentions fainting or fatigue. They speak with the quick, secret joy of people remembering their own names after years of using someone else's. But it isn't universal. For every noble peeling off layers of invented fragility, there's another retreating deeper into it. Some have come to need their illnesses the way others need titles or lands. It's no longer a disguise, it's become the skeleton of their lives. You hear of one lord who's locked himself in his bedchamber, claiming he's afflicted with post-delusional vertigo, an ailment brought on by the collapse of his own performance. "I don't know what to do with my hands," he shouts through the door. I used to hold props. A quiet kind of grief settles in among those who are letting go. For all the absurdity of the game, it offered structure. When you woke up each morning as the Countess with a trembling rib, you knew your role. You had an audience, a script, a shape to your day. Now the unscripted hours stretch wide and blank. Alderic walks the halls like a cautious gardener, trimming back the worst of the overgrowth, but careful not to tear out anything still blooming. He's softened somewhat less, surgeon, more shepherd. He understands now that this isn't a cure he can force. It's a willingness that must grow from within, like breath returning after a long underwater dive. In a small salon, he finds Lord Octave sitting by the fire, stroking his own pulse as if surprised it's still there. Octave once claimed to suffer from vanishing heartbeat syndrome. Now he's counting each thud aloud. 1, he whispers. 2, 3. Alderic says nothing. You find yourself writing again, not in the voice of a chronicler or a guest, but your own. You describe what you've seen, yes, but also how it felt to be surrounded by so much beauty, so much tragedy, and so much invented sorrow. You realize that this place, as strange as it is, has taught you something you never expected to learn: the difference between escape and expression. Because that's what all this was. A court full of people aching to be known, unable to say it plainly. So they cloaked their needs in invented fevers, dramatized colds, poetic swoons. It was the only language they were allowed to speak. And now they are learning new ones. You pass Amori in the corridor that evening. He's walking alone, no procession, no limp, no shawl. He carries a book under one arm and a fresh peach in the other. He nods to you. "I'm bored," he says. You raise an eyebrow. "It's terrifying," he admits, "but also kind of exciting." That night the moon hangs low over the orchard. No one claims to be allergic to it. No one faints under its glow. Instead, you hear someone laughing in the dark. A small, genuine laugh. The kind that needs no audience at all. Spring arrives in soft bursts, first with the snowmelt dripping from the arches, then with green buds on the hawthorn trees just outside the kitchen window. The castle, once steeped in incense and the scent of clove-infused compresses, now smells of thawed earth, fresh air, and occasionally bread. Real bread. Not the kind that served as part of a recovery ritual, but the kind meant to be torn into with hunger and heat. The nobles begin moving differently now. You notice it in small things. Fewer handkerchiefs tucked into sleeves. Fewer pale gloves donned to ward off mood drafts. The ever-present veils and robes of fragility begin to vanish like winter fog, revealing almost shyly the human shapes beneath. Amori has taken to walking the garden paths each morning. No entourage, no grand declarations. He just walks. He studies the bees, names birds under his breath. Sometimes he writes in a journal you're no longer allowed to see, and you understand. It's no longer performance. It's something more private, more sacred. Even the great hall, once a cathedral to pageantry, has changed. The banners remain, but they've been shifted to allow more light. The long feasting table has been shortened to encourage closer conversation. Meals are quieter now, but not awkward, just slower, as if everyone is learning to listen again without needing to perform their pain to be heard. And yet there are still echoes of the past. At supper one evening, Lady Isabeau absent-mindedly reaches for her fan before realizing she no longer wears one. She looks momentarily lost, as if something important was left behind, something she cannot retrieve. Then she folds her hands and smiles, saying, "My fingers still remember how to tremble." Isn't that strange? You nod, because you understand. The body doesn't forget its roles all at once. That same night, you come upon a curious scene in the eastern corridor. A group of younger nobles are gathered, standing in a ring around a boy no older than 16. He's performing what seems to be a dramatic collapse, clutching his chest, gasping about a heartbreak-induced spinal rattle. The others watch, unsure. Some look amused. One or two shift uncomfortably. No one applauds. The boy finishes, eyes fluttering closed, clearly waiting for validation. Instead, someone gently steps forward and helps him stand. No teasing, no cruelty, just a quiet, You don't have to do that anymore. He nods, swallows hard, doesn't speak. You watch it all from the edge of the archway and realize the tide has turned. The language of false affliction has become obsolete not from decree, but from disuse. And now this strange court must learn to speak a new tongue entirely. But not everyone finds it easy. Lord Emmerich has disappeared into the West Wing. He was once the loudest performer of them all, master of limp and legend. Now he's simply absent. When you ask about him, servants shake their heads. He's unwell, they say. But you know what they mean. He's forgotten how to be without the artifice. And no one's quite sure how to reach him. Alderic tries. Quiet visits. Letters. One evening he leaves a stool outside Emmerich's door with a bowl of soup and a book of proverbs. The next morning the bowl is empty. The book is gone. Small steps. Not unlike Amori's first 6, outside the land remembers itself. Trees stretch, streams crackle through old paths. Even the animals seem less wary. You spot a fox near the orchard wall one dawn, not darting or trembling, but sitting still, watching the world without fear. One afternoon, a letter arrives from a neighboring court. It's filled with the usual diplomatic overtures, but between the lines you spot something remarkable. The noble who penned it signs not with their usual affliction-based pseudonym, but with their birth name. Just a name, no symptoms, no theater, just truth. The ripples are spreading. At dinner that night, Amori lifts his glass and says, "To feeling better," whatever that ends up meaning. And for the first time in a long while, the toast feels like a beginning rather than an ending. The days grow longer now, golden light stretching past supper, casting long, honest shadows against the castle walls. The air smells different, less like ointment and crushed violets, more like warm stone moss and the faint sweetness of blooming things. The old rituals, the bells for broth, the daily fainting hours, the afternoon poetry weeps, are gone. No one officially ended them. They just stopped happening. In their place, silence sometimes, but also life. You hear laughter in the garden, not high-pitched performance giggles, but deep startled laughter that cracks out suddenly and leaves people wiping their eyes with real joy. Someone tries to describe it as a spontaneous optimism episode, and they all burst out laughing again. This time, no one writes it down as a symptom. People are unlearning their choreography. At first, it's clumsy. There are awkward pauses in conversations where a noble might once have feigned a sudden bout of emotion-induced stammer. Meals are quiet with fewer ornate declarations and more soft-spoken questions like, "How did you sleep and what did you notice today?" The answers are ordinary, and that's what makes them extraordinary. You find Amori seated on a low wall in the orchard one afternoon, peeling a pear with a small, tarnished knife. He offers you half. You sit beside him. No one speaks for several minutes. Then he says, "I had a headache this morning. A real one. Nothing poetic about it." You ask what he did. "I drank water. Then took a nap. Felt better." You both nod. It's the most radical thing you've heard all week. Inside, the transformation continues. Lady Iseldra now tends the herb garden, with bare hands, dirt under her fingernails, and a sunburn she doesn't hide. She used to cover her wrists in lace to protect against the breeze's mournful bite. Now she rolls up her sleeves. Lord Beltran has stopped sitting at the edge of rooms pretending his back cannot bear the presence of too many opinions. He's begun taking walks with Lady Isabeau, who recently confessed she still feels the pull of the performance. Some mornings she told you, "I want to invent a reason to lie in bed and be visited, but then I get up anyway." And that's enough, I think. You start noticing other things too. The staff, once invisible, once trained to play along with every feigned affliction, are more relaxed now. A maid jokes with her mistress about how the spirit chills seem to have cleared right up since we stopped heating the wine with star water. Even the steward, a man who once carried a tiny bell to alert others of Lord Emmerich's oncoming poetry seizures, now carries a basket of fresh linen instead. There's no ceremony to any of it. The illusions, once so meticulously constructed, are fading like chalk in the rain. But of course, not everyone fades at the same pace. You hear stories from other courts, places where the theater of illness still thrives. A noble in Aragon has declared he can only eat if doves are singing in the room. A duchess in Vienna reportedly claims her tears are healing and bottles them for guests. The fashion lingers in the corners of the continent, stubborn and romantic. Even here you hear mutterings that perhaps this honesty is temporary, that the ache for drama, for curated sorrow, will return with the winter winds. But for now they are present. And that is everything. You spend more time with the journals now, not reading them, but sorting them. You find yourself drawn to the oldest ones. The first entries, written in careful hands, felt a strange tightness in the chest. Might be love. Might be God. Called it ailment so I wouldn't have to explain. It feels less like a deception and more like a cry for language. They didn't know how to speak plainly, so they sang it through symptoms. You find yourself forgiving them. One evening you pass a chamber once infamous for its theatrical collapses. The doors are open now. A fire crackles gently inside. A noble is playing chess with a servant. No one faints. No one declares they're being crushed by nostalgia. Someone loses a rook and says simply, "Bad move." And that's that. No one applauds. No one writes a sonnet about it. They just reset the board and play again. The rhythm of life settles into something quieter now. Not dull, not lifeless, but gentler. As though everyone in the castle has exhaled at last. For years, they breathed in drama and artifice, held it in their lungs until their bodies bent under the weight. But now they breathe something simpler. And it's enough. The change is everywhere. Lady Sancia no longer keeps her mood veils color-coded for daily ailments. The ornate cabinet where she stored them has been repurposed to hold seed packets and gardening gloves. She smiles more now. Frowns, too. Her emotions arrive in their own time, not summoned, not staged, but real. In the scriptorium, Lord Emmerich returns quietly. He doesn't announce it. No trumpets. No claim of divine revelation. One morning he's just there, sitting at a long table, copying verses from a psalm, with a hand that trembles slightly. When someone greets him, he doesn't reply with a monologue about throat stillness or sacred muteness. He just says, "Good morning." It's more shocking than any swoon. Even the youngest nobles who grew up in the shadow of endless performance now experiment with plainness. They gather in the orchard to read, not with feigned dizziness or velvet cushions, but cross-legged on the grass elbows, dirtied laughing between lines. One recites a verse from a new book and calls it terrible. The others agree. They don't pretend otherwise. A few still falter. You see a girl about 15 rehearsing a shiver in the mirror, holding her breath as she tips her head just so. But before the motion finishes, she catches her own reflection and lets the act dissolve. She stares at herself a long moment. Then she picks up a brush and simply begins combing her hair. Progress is never perfect. In the great hall, the tapestries remain. You had expected someone to take them down, the ones depicting invented ailments as allegorical beasts, the ones that glorify noble suffering with halos and sighs. But no, they stay. And maybe that's right. Maybe they're part of the story now, not something to hide, but something to remember. One afternoon, a visitor arrives from a far-off duchy. She arrives swathed in layers of gauze, escorted by servants who announce her every symptom. Lady Clemence of the ever-weeping spine, they declare, requests her broth lukewarm, her pillows wind-fluffed, and her conversation conducted only in minor chords. The castle doesn't laugh at her, but no one indulges her either. She is given a room, a quiet one, no audience, no gathering. When she descends for supper, expecting a dramatic inquiry into her condition, no one asks. Someone simply offers her bread and says, "There's plum tart, if you'd like some later." By the second night, she's asking questions instead of performing. By the fourth, she's wearing only 2 layers of gauze. By the 7th, she eats the plum tart and smiles. It spreads like that now, not like fever, but like warmth. And yet, none of this is being recorded the way the illnesses once were. There are no journals labeled symptoms of simplicity, no catalogs of days without embellishment. The shift is too subtle, too ordinary, which is precisely why it matters. You find yourself wondering if perhaps the nobles have not abandoned performance but transformed it. Perhaps simplicity has become their new theater, an honest one, where a sunrise is enough drama and a full night's sleep is the climax of the week. Amaury still writes, but privately now, sometimes by candlelight, sometimes beneath the lime trees. You pass him once and ask, still composing new ailments, he smiles, just remembering the old ones. They were beautiful lies, but they were lies all the same. You pause, and now I'm trying to tell the truth, even when it's boring. It's the most radical thing he's ever said. In the evenings, the castle no longer hums with practiced coughs and choreographed swoons. It creaks, it crackles, it breathes. Someone plays a lute badly. Someone else sings off-key. No one apologizes. No one faints. The world hasn't become perfect, just quieter, truer. And in that truth, these nobles, once draped in invented grief, are discovering something far more precious than pity. Peace. The final weeks of spring bring a softness to everything. The castle, once an echo chamber of sighs and whispers, now feels like a home. Not just a stage set for elaborate collapse, but a place where people live, breathe, and quietly figure out who they are when no one's watching. You walk through the halls past portraits of long-dead nobles who once performed their pains with theatrical flourish. You wonder what they'd think of this quieter age. Maybe they'd scoff. Maybe they'd join. Or maybe deep down this is what they always wanted, the chance to rest without having to invent a reason. In the kitchens, the staff sings again. It's a simple tune, an old lullaby carried over bubbling pots and drying herbs. No one claims to have written it from a fever dream. No one says the melody came to them during a sacred vision. It's just a song. And it's lovely. In the courtyard, Amaury teaches a younger noble how to prune grapevines. He moves slowly, carefully, speaking of tendrils and roots rather than metaphors. When the boy cuts too high, Amaury simply shows him again. No riddles, no philosophical moans, just instruction, just presence. Later that day, you sit beside the fountain that once served as a stage for impromptu drownings of sorrow. Now it's just a fountain. The water dances and splashes. A child barefoot, unembellished, leans over the edge and drops in a stone. The ripples spread wide, then disappear, You find Lord Emmerich sitting beneath an arch, sketching the scene in charcoal. He used to write verses about chest pains caused by disappointment. Now he's drawing real things, hands, waterlight. No declarations, just lines. You ask if he misses the performance. He pauses. Sometimes he admits. It was a kind of armor. But armor gets heavy. You nod. And the wind shifts. By now, even the language has changed. Illness is no longer the first assumption. A headache is just a headache. A pause in conversation doesn't signal a fainting spell. People listen more. Ask more. There's no need to dramatize discomfort to be seen. A hand placed gently on a shoulder is enough. A simple, "Are you all right?" carries more weight than 1,000 invented syndromes. And there is laughter, real crackling, surprised laughter that rolls through the halls like spring rain over cobblestones. You pass a room where once nobles staged a 3-day weeping contest. Today, the same space holds a pottery wheel. A young woman sculpts clumsily while an older man helps her center the clay. Not too much pressure, he says. Let it wobble a bit. The metaphor writes itself, and still the echoes of the past remain. The great book of imagined ailments, the one bound in red leather, once kept under lock and key, now rests on a central shelf in the library. Anyone can read it. It's not hidden. It's not mocked. It's simply part of their story now. Amori adds a final entry in its back pages one evening. You watch him write it in ink darker than usual, the tip of his pen resting gently between each line. We once performed sickness to be seen. Now we allow silence to speak. The body still aches. The heart still bruises. But we meet it standing, whole, undecorated. Enough. He closes the book, doesn't lock it, just walks away. And the castle breathes. You spend your final morning in the orchard, where bees hum low and branches droop heavy with early fruit. A servant picks the ripest apricots for the kitchen. Someone sings as they pass. There are no rehearsals scheduled, no audience expected. Just sunlight, just wind, just life. So now, as your eyes grow heavier and your breath slows, imagine you're lying beneath a high-arched window in a castle no longer obsessed with sorrow. The walls are warm with candlelight. The floors creak gently with familiar footsteps, nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. Just people going about their lives, real lives, quiet lives. You feel the softness of linen against your skin, the weight of a woolen blanket pulled just right. In some distant hallway, laughter rises, not sharp, not theatrical, just true. Someone drops a spoon, a dog barks, a lute is tuned badly, and through it all the world keeps turning. There are no invented fevers here, no staged collapses, no metaphors masquerading as medicine. Just the rise and fall of ordinary breaths, and the freedom to say, I'm fine today. And if I'm not, that's all right too. The nobles you've met along this journey are learning slowly, awkwardly, tenderly, that truth is not something to fear, that you don't need to suffer in poetry to be loved, that there is a kind of power in simplicity, in saying what you mean, in living without veils. So rest now. Let your mind drift from castles and coughs, from sighs and silk pillows. Let the imagined ailments dissolve into mist, and let the real you remain. Whole, soft, untitled. You are not a performance. You are here. You are enough.